At 6:14 in the morning, Princess and received a sealed palace folder containing every official duty Queen Camilla had held the day before. State receptions, military commemorations, charity visits, diplomatic briefings. The entire public program had been transferred into Anne's name. But Anne did not begin by reading the new schedule. She stopped at the final page. A cream-colored file had been placed separately from the rest of the documents. Across the front, in black capital letters, were 4 words that made the room go silent. Final duty. Below them was a red stamp. Do not transfer. And looked at the senior aide who had delivered the folder and asked the only question that mattered. Who put this here? The aide did not answer immediately. That hesitation told, and this was not a normal administrative decision. The palace had moved Camilla's entire official role overnight, but someone had deliberately protected one final appearance from the transfer. Not delayed it, not canceled it, protected it. And the most surprising part was that King Charles had already ordered Anne to take it. Before the day was over, Anne would have to decide whether to obey her brother, take Camilla's last remaining duty, and make the transfer complete, or refuse a direct royal instruction and risk turning a private palace fracture into a public crisis. Because the file did not contain an ordinary engagement. It contained a promise. A promise Camilla had made long before the argument that changed everything. And inside the folder was one handwritten sentence that Anne could not ignore. Do not let them turn this into a punishment. The words were unsigned. They did not need to be. Anne knew exactly who had written them. The palace statement had described the transfer as continuity. It spoke about stable representation, orderly planning, and the need to protect the royal program from disruption. But behind those careful words was a different reality. Charles had removed Camilla from the duties that made her visible beside him, and had been asked to carry the work. And one final event had been left hanging between the king, his wife, and his sister. Before we go further, subscribe for more fictional royal drama stories about duty, loyalty, and the private cost of power. Because this was not simply a story about a queen consort losing a calendar. It was about the one duty Anne refused to take. And the reason she refused was something Charles did not discover until it was almost too late. Charles signed the transfer order alone. In this fictional story, he did not call his advisors into the room when the final copy arrived. He did not ask for another legal explanation. He had already read the key sentence 3 times. All official duties formerly assigned to the queen consort would move to Princess Anne's office with immediate effect. The order covered appearances, patronages, diplomatic welcomes, ceremonial visits, and the briefings required to represent the crown. It was not a request for and to fill a few dates. It was a complete change in who the palace trusted to stand beside the king in public. Charles placed his signature at the bottom of the page, then held the pen for a moment longer than necessary. He understood exactly how it would look. To the public, it would appear as a major royal restructuring. To Camilla, it would feel like a personal rejection signed by her own husband. And to Anne, it would become a responsibility nobody could carry without being accused of taking advantage of another woman's loss. A royal program is more than a diary. It decides who receives the briefing notes, who meets representatives from abroad, who is placed at the center of official photographs, and who can speak with the authority of the crown behind them. By transferring that program, Charles was not changing a schedule. He was changing proximity to power. His private secretary asked whether the statement should mention a temporary review. Charles said no. Not because he wanted the arrangement to be permanent, but because uncertainty would make the palace look weaker. If the statement sounded hesitant, every canceled appearance and every reassigned staff member would become proof that the king had lost control of his own household. The wording had to be firm. That firmness came at a cost. Camilla was told shortly before the announcement. Her secretary read the first paragraph aloud, then stopped when Camilla lifted her hand. Camilla did not ask which duties were moving. She asked whether Charles had approved every word. When her secretary said yes, Camilla looked toward the window and said nothing. She had spent years defending her place in royal life. In this imagined scenario, the official role had become the clearest sign that she belonged beside Charles. Now, in one morning, that role was being moved to Anne. Meanwhile, Charles called Anne into his study. He expected anger. Instead, Anne placed the folder on his desk and asked, "Why is the final duty still separate?" Charles's expression changed. He told her it was not separate. It was overdue. And he ordered and to take it with everything else. That was the moment, and said no. And did not refuse the final duty because she wanted to challenge Charles. She refused because she had opened the file. Inside was not a routine speech, a diplomatic timetable, or another polished set of palace instructions. It was the program for the fictional National Service of Thanks, an annual memorial event honoring families whose loved ones had served the country. The event was small by royal standards. No glittering state banquet. No foreign ambassadors. No grand balcony appearance. But for Camilla, it carried a meaning no advisor could measure in a diary. Months earlier, she had promised a military widow that she would attend personally. Not because the engagement would create headlines, but because the woman had written to the palace after losing her husband and asked whether anyone in royal life still understood what it meant to keep a promise when the cameras were gone. Camilla had answered herself. That reply was inside the file, and read it once. Then again, Camilla had written that no family should feel forgotten once the formal condolences ended. She had promised to place a white rose at the memorial wall and meet the families privately before the public ceremony began. The appointment had never been about power. It had never been about visibility. It had been about a promise. And now Charles wanted Anne to take it simply because every other duty had moved to her office. And looked across the desk at her brother. "This is not an appointment," she said. "It is hers." Charles replied that Camilla could no longer represent the crown officially. The transfer had to be complete. A partial handover would invite questions, speculation, and fresh conflict. And understood the argument. But she also understood the cruelty hidden inside it. If she attended, the palace would appear organized. But the family who had been expecting Camilla would see another woman arrive in her place. They would not understand transfer orders. They would not understand palace restructuring. They would only understand that a promise had been broken, Charles told, and that the memorial could not be canceled. Press had already been notified. Security arrangements were in place. The families had been invited. Any uncertainty would become a public embarrassment at the worst possible moment. And closed the file. Then she noticed a small envelope tucked behind the event program. Her name was written across the front. Not Princess Anne. Just Anne. Inside was a single line in Camilla's handwriting. "Please do not let my mistake become their disappointment." And looked at Charles. For the first time, the king understood why his sister was refusing. But he still did not know what Anne intended to do instead. The crisis had not started with the transfer order. It had started 10 days earlier at a formal palace reception where everyone continued smiling, even after the atmosphere inside the room had changed. In this fictional scenario, Charles was due to welcome a group of visiting representatives before opening a new service initiative, and had been assigned to lead the first presentation because she had spent months preparing the background work. Camilla was scheduled to stand beside the king for the official photographs. The arrangement had been approved. The briefing cards had been printed. The order of entry had been confirmed. Then, less than an hour before the reception began, a revised instruction reached the protocol office, and would no longer lead the presentation. Her speaking role would be shortened. Camilla would step forward beside Charles instead. At first, the staff believed there had been a misunderstanding, but the revised instruction carried language suggesting the king had approved it, and saw the change only minutes before guests arrived. A senior aide offered to correct the program immediately, and refused, not because she accepted the decision, but because the room was already filling with diplomats. A public argument would embarrass Charles. It would make the crown look uncertain before the event had even begun. So Anne stepped back. She allowed Camilla to take the central place. She stood where the new card placed her, and she completed her reduced role without revealing a single sign of anger. But Charles noticed. He noticed Anne's prepared remarks had been shortened. He noticed the presentation no longer followed the plan he had approved. And when the final guest had left, he asked for the original briefing folder. That was when the difference became impossible to ignore. The original document showed Anne leading the initiative. The altered one moved her aside. Attached to both files was a warning from the protocol office. It stated that changes to the king's formal role required direct confirmation from Charles himself. No such confirmation existed. In this imagined story, Camilla admitted that she had asked staff to revise the arrangement. She believed the king's wife should not appear secondary at an event hosted in his name. She believed Anne's closeness to Charles was slowly pushing her toward the edge of royal life. But Charles did not hear insecurity. He heard that his authority had been used without his consent. That was what shattered his confidence. The transfer order was not revenge for one reception. It was Charles's response to the fear that private tension had entered the official machinery of the palace. And now, as held Camilla's final duty file, she faced a question nobody else had asked. If Camilla had made a serious mistake, did that mean every promise she made afterward deserved to be taken from her? Charles listened, as placed the final duty file back on his desk. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside the study, the palace was already preparing for the memorial. Security plans had been finalized. Cars had been scheduled. The guest list had been checked twice. Families had been told a senior royal would attend. The event was moving forward. Only the person who would stand before them was uncertain. Charles broke the silence first. The program has been transferred, he said. The final duty goes with it. And did not raise her voice. That program is public, she replied. This promise is personal. Charles said the distinction no longer mattered. Camilla could not appear in an official capacity while the transfer order was in force. Sending her would confuse the press, undermine the statement, and invite immediate questions about whether the palace had reversed its decision, and understood every practical reason. That was what made it difficult. Charles was not asking her to be cruel. He was asking her to be clear. But clarity can become cruelty when it reaches people who have no part in a family conflict. And opened the file again and pointed to the handwritten reply Camilla had sent the widow months earlier. This family did not ask for a palace crisis, and said. They asked whether a promise would be kept. Charles looked at the page, but did not answer. Then he said the words, and had feared. I am instructing you to attend. The room changed. This was no longer a conversation between a brother and sister. It was a direct instruction from the king to the woman, now carrying the largest share of his official program. And knew refusing him would carry consequences. Staff would notice. Advisors would question it. Camilla could interpret it as trying to build her own side inside the palace. And also knew what taking the duty would look like. A grieving family would arrive expecting Camilla. They would see, and instead, they would assume the promise had meant nothing. And close the folder. I will not attend as her replacement, she said. Charles's face hardened. Then what do you propose? And looked at the cream page, marked final duty. I propose we stop treating this like an appointment. Charles said nothing, and continued. If Camilla cannot represent the crown, then she should not. But she can still keep a human promise. And if the palace cannot understand the difference, then the palace is the problem. For the first time, Charles appeared less angry than uncertain. But before he could answer, an aide entered carrying urgent news. Camilla had requested the final duty file, and she wanted to see it alone, and found Camilla waiting in a private sitting room with no staff present. The final duty file sat unopened on the table between them. Camilla did not ask about the transfer order. She did not ask which duties had moved. She did not ask whether Charles had changed his mind. She looked directly at Anne and asked, Did he tell you to take this too? And did not lie. Yes. Camilla nodded once, as if she had expected the answer. Then she said something and had not expected. I asked for the file to be protected before he signed anything. The room went quiet, and looked down at the cream page. Camilla explained that she had known the memorial would be vulnerable if the palace crisis became public. She understood that any transfer of duties would make the event difficult. She understood that Charles might decide she could not attend. But she had hoped the promise itself would survive. I did not ask them to protect my position, Camilla said. I asked them to protect that family. And asked why Camilla had not told Charles. Camilla's expression changed. Because I was tired of asking him to see the difference. For the first time, and saw the pain beneath Camilla's anger. Camilla had made a serious mistake at the earlier reception. She did not deny it. She admitted that fear of being pushed aside had made her act rashly. But she believed Charles had now made the opposite mistake, treating every part of her public life as though it carried the same meaning. The final duty did not. It was not a state banquet. It was not a photograph. It was not a symbol of who held power. It was a promise to people who had already lost enough. Camilla opened the file and removed another sheet and had not seen before. It was a note from the widow. The woman had written that she was bringing her young daughter to the memorial because Camilla had promised the child that the white rose would be placed before the cameras arrived, and read the final line slowly. She still asks about you every morning. Camilla folded the note. Then she made a request that stunned Anne. Do not take my place, she said, but do not send me either. And looked up. Camilla explained that appearing publicly would turn the memorial into a royal story. Reporters would ask questions. Cameras would follow her. The family's grief would disappear behind the palace conflict. "I need you to find another way," Camilla said, and asked what that meant. Camilla placed the white rose listed in the event folder on the table. Then she said, "Make sure the promise is kept without making the promise about me," and understood the impossible task. She had to protect Camilla's dignity, obey Charles's need for stability, and keep a grieving family from becoming collateral damage. But the memorial was only hours away, and Charles had just learned that and still had no intention of attending as his replacement. Charles was waiting in his study when and returned. He knew where she had been. He knew Camilla had asked to see her. And he knew the final duty file was still unopened beneath Anne's arm. "What did she say?" he asked, and placed the folder on his desk. "She said the event should not become a story about her." Charles nodded slowly. "Then the decision is simple. You attend," and did not move. "No," she said. Charles looked up and explained that sending her in Camilla's place would not protect the families. It would only create a cleaner palace photograph. The headlines would say Anne had taken the final duty. Camilla's private promise would become evidence of her removal, and the widow's daughter would spend the day watching adults turn grief into an argument about royal rank. Charles said the palace could not send Camilla, and agreed. "But you can go." For several seconds, Charles did not respond. The suggestion was not part of any official plan. A sovereign does not suddenly appear at a small memorial without creating consequences. Security needed to be changed. The guest list needed to be protected. Staff would ask questions. The press would notice eventually. But Anne was not asking Charles to replace Camilla on the public stage. She was asking him to keep the promise before the cameras arrived. "The family is expecting a white rose," Anne said. "Not a speech. Not a new royal hierarchy. A promise." Charles looked at the rose resting beside the file and continued. "You signed the order because you believed duty required a boundary. Then carry the boundary yourself. Do not ask me to turn it into punishment." The words landed harder than Charles expected. For the first time, he saw the final duty not as a logistical problem, but as the human cost of a decision he had made for institutional survival. He had protected the monarchy, but he had not protected the people caught beneath its decisions. Charles called his private secretary and issued an instruction that surprised everyone in the room. The public memorial would continue exactly as planned, and would oversee the program from a distance. No announcement would be made about Camilla. No replacement would stand at the podium. And before the event began, Charles would meet the widow and her daughter privately at the memorial wall. The white rose would be placed. The promise would be kept. But there was one complication nobody had anticipated. Camilla had already left the palace, and she was on her way to the memorial too. The memorial grounds were already filling when Anne arrived. Families stood quietly near the stone wall, carrying photographs, flowers, and small handwritten cards. Palace staff moved with careful urgency, checking microphones, pathways, and the private room prepared for Charles's meeting. The public program was still scheduled to begin in less than an hour. No one outside the palace knew that the royal plan had changed 3 times before breakfast, and stood near the entrance, holding the final duty file beneath her arm, when a security officer approached with an expression that immediately told her something had gone wrong. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "the Queen Consort's car has arrived," and turned. Camilla had not come in full ceremonial dress. She had not brought staff or prepared for cameras. She stepped from the vehicle wearing a dark coat, carrying no folder and no speech. Only a single white rose. The moment reporters recognized her, lenses lifted. This was exactly what Charles had feared. If Camilla entered publicly, every story would become about the transfer. The families gathered around the memorial would become background figures in a palace conflict. Questions would be asked before the ceremony was even over, and cross the path before anyone else could reach her. Camilla stopped. For a second, the two women stood face to face beneath the attention of distant cameras. Camilla spoke first. "I am not here to represent anyone," and looked at the rose in her hand. "I know." Camilla said she had come to place it herself. She did not want a speech. She did not want a public role. She wanted only to keep the promise she had made before the palace crisis turned everything into a question of authority, and told her Charles was already inside with the widow and her daughter. Camilla's face changed. He came and nodded. He understood what the duty was. The tension between them softened, But the danger remained. Reporters were moving closer. Staff were waiting for instructions. One photograph of Camilla entering the memorial could create a headline that swallowed the entire purpose of the day, and made a decision. She asked Camilla to enter through the small garden path behind the memorial wall. No cameras could see it from there, and would keep the front program moving while Charles met the family privately. Camilla hesitated. Will they know I came? And looked at the white rose. They will know the promise mattered. Camilla gave the rose to Anne. Then she walked toward the garden path alone. But as Anne turned back toward the waiting crowd, a reporter called out a question that froze the entire entrance. Princess Anne, has Queen Camilla been banned from the memorial? Every camera turned toward Anne, and she had only one sentence to decide whether to speak, and did not look toward the reporter. She looked instead at the families gathered near the memorial wall. Then she said, "Today is not about a royal diary. It is about people whose promises deserve to be remembered." The sentence was calm, but it ended the question. Palace staff guided the press line back. The program began. No official explanation was offered about Camilla's absence, Anne's refusal, or Charles's unexpected arrival. For the first time since the transfer order had been signed, and had protected the crown without allowing it to hide behind protocol. She walked to the front of the memorial and delivered only a short introduction. There was no speech about palace stability, no mention of changed duties, no carefully designed phrase meant to control tomorrow's headlines. She spoke about service, about loss, about the responsibility to remember people after public attention has moved on. Then she stepped back. Inside the small private garden, Charles stood beside the widow and her daughter. The child held the white rose between both hands. Camilla approached slowly from the garden path, out of sight of the main cameras. She stopped a few steps away, uncertain whether she had the right to cross the final distance. The widow saw her first. There was no anger in her face, only relief. "You came," she said. Camilla looked toward Charles, then back at the family. "I promised," she answered. The daughter offered Camilla the rose. For a moment, nobody spoke. Camilla took it carefully, knelt beside the memorial wall, and placed it beneath the engraved names. Charles stood behind her, not as a king making an appearance, not as a husband protecting a public image, simply as the man who had finally understood what his decision had nearly taken away. From the front of the grounds, and saw the moment through the open garden gate. She did not move toward it. She did not interrupt. She allowed Camilla to keep the promise privately while the official program continued without disruption. That was Anne's refusal. She had refused to become the public replacement for a private promise. By the time the ceremony ended, the photographs had already begun appearing online. Most showed Anne at the memorial, composed and steady. Others showed Charles arriving through a side entrance. But one image carried a different meaning. Taken from a distance, it showed a white rose resting beneath the memorial wall. No faces, no headline, no explanation. Yet everyone inside the palace understood what it meant. The final duty had not been transferred. It had been transformed. Later that evening, Charles returned to the palace carrying the empty final duty file, and was waiting in the study. He placed it on the desk between them. Then he said something she had not expected. "You were right." But, and knew the harder question had not yet been answered. What would Camilla do when she learned Charles had finally understood, after taking almost everything else away? Charles found Camilla later that evening in the same sitting room where she had asked and not to take her place. The crimson folder was gone. The final duty file had been returned to the palace archive. Only the white rose remained, resting in a glass of water near the window. For several seconds, Charles did not speak. He had signed an order that moved Camilla away from every major official duty. He had told himself it was necessary. He had believed clear authority mattered more than private comfort. But the memorial had forced him to see the difference between removing someone from power and removing them from humanity. Camilla spoke first. "Did Anne attend?" Charles shook his head. "No." Camilla looked down. "Then who did?" Charles answered quietly. "I did." That was when Camilla finally looked at him. Charles told her what Anne had said. He told her that the final duty had not been a schedule entry. It had been a promise. He admitted that he had been so determined to prevent another breach of trust that he had started treating every part of Camilla's role as though it carried the same danger. Camilla did not deny her mistake. In this fictional story, she admitted that fear had made her try to control an event she should have trusted the king to lead. She admitted that she had allowed the question of where she stood to matter more than the purpose of the ceremony itself. But she also told Charles that losing every duty in a single morning had made her feel as if their years together could be moved into a folder and handed to somebody else. Charles did not defend the order. He said only, "I should have set the boundary before I was forced to make it hurt." The words did not erase what had happened. They did not return the program. But they were the first honest words either of them had spoken without advisors, protocol, or public language standing between them. The transfer would remain in place for the time being, and would continue carrying the official schedule. The palace needed stability, and Charles could not pretend otherwise. But Camilla's private charitable commitments would be protected, not as secret substitutions, not as a challenge to the order, as personal promises that did not belong to the machinery of royal power. Later that night, and received a handwritten note. It came from Camilla. There were only 2 sentences. The work needed to continue. Thank you for remembering that people are not work. And read it once, then placed it beside the final duty file. Outside her office, staff were preparing the next day's revised program. The transfer had changed the palace. It had changed the balance around Charles. It had given and responsibilities she never wanted and placed Camilla at a distance from the role she once held. And had refused the one thing that would have turned duty into humiliation. She refused to take a promise that was never hers. And in doing so, she forced Charles to understand something the palace had almost forgotten. A crown survives because rules are respected. But people survive because someone knows when rules are not enough. The final duty was never canceled. It was never transferred. It was kept. And when and refused it, she did not weaken the monarchy. She protected the one thing the transfer order could not measure: dignity.